Hello, you might be noticing I'm not standing up. We're doing something a bit different here. This is the first episode of a new series I want to start called Comic Covers. Basically, it's a show where we cover comics. I came up with it one day at work and I just knew I had to do something with it. So we're going to be starting with X-Men. Not just any X-Men, the very first issue of X-Men. The reason why I'm starting with specifically the first issue of X-Men is mainly because I want to start with something not great, because it's a lot easier to talk about something that's shit than something that's like good, you know? I could talk about like All-Star Superman and Batman Year 1, but like I wouldn't be able to say as much. This, for better and for worse, I've got a lot to say about X-Men issue 1. So this is really Penguin Classics, which this is mainly just meant for like actual classic literature. But because Marvel is, so impactful, they've collected a good few of their starting ones. They've also done Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Avengers, Captain America, and Black Panther, I believe. I'm waiting until they inevitably collect Dazzler, because she's clearly had a lot of impact. But alas, I don't think that will be the case. So yeah, it basically is just like the entire, it's like a bunch of iconic issues from their beginning, and it... basically a perfect look at why the old X-Men fucking suck. So, I'm not even going to beat around the bush. Original X-Men, so in the Silver Age at least, they were not very good at all. So, the thing is, a lot of 60s stuff, I personally think, isn't that bad. There's a lot of real stinkers like Daredevil and like the Avengers, but you also get Fantastic Four, which while having 60s Sue Storm in it, who is one of the worst characters both in how she's written and how she's treated, which is the rare twofer. There's also like 60s Spider-Man, which genuinely I think is the only Silver Age comic that I'd say is genuinely worth your time. Is more than like a history piece. Like, being able to look at the very beginning of Spider-Man, if you're interested, I think is a generally very worthwhile cause. And that was actually, fun fact, how I started reading comics. So I started with the comic fucking everyone ever has started out with, of course, the one and only Ultimate Spider-Man. Everyone fucking starts with that nowadays, because it's like one of the best comic runs ever made. And I read a good few bit of that, and I was like, hey, I want to read the original. So I went back and I read 60s Spider-Man, and I was like, hey, you know what, this, it's very, very aged. But there's a lot of charm to it. And, I was really interested in X-Men. So I started with Ultimate X-Men, which was already bad. And then I was like, hey, I've already done, this with Spider-Man. I'm going to go and do 60s X-Men. So I didn't actually get this. I read it on sites, the ones. I'm actually very grateful I read this early on, because it taught me a very important lesson when it comes to comics. You can skip shit you don't like. One of the biggest things I will say to anyone getting into comic books is if you're not clicking with a writer, if you're not clicking with an art style, or you think this current story arc is boring as shit, you can skip it. It's fine. Comics are not one continuous narrative. It's like different bits and pieces of narrative. It's one of the most bizarre ongoing forms of storytelling there is because of it. So generally, for the most part, it's not something like an anime. Like, if you're reading One Piece and you just skip Skypiea, like, you're still going to be missing out on a lot of, like, actual context, You're reading JoJo, you decide to just skip part 4. Why would you do that? But with comics, because there's not a continual narrative, you can skip stuff. And 60s X-Men taught me that. Because I would have started at the beginning, and oh my god, everything in this sucks. So... it first begins with Charles Xavier. He's standing there, and he's sitting there, of course. He can't really stand. And he says, oh, all the X-Men, come to me. All these old comics, I read like a big transatlantic accent, because I don't know why, I just always see it as the case. And you can see one thing that's quite interesting in the very beginning. They're wearing black suits. A very common thing back then was black with blue as highlights, so you could see what it actually was, of course. I think it was something due to just like difficulties printing different shades of black and such back then. So what ended up happening is that a lot of these outfits, for example, Spider-Man is probably the most infamous example of this. They went from being like black and whatever, like black and yellow for this, black and red for Spider-Man, into being blue and yellow, and then like red and blue for Spider-Man. I'm really grateful that happened because I feel as though like there's just not a lot of character in a lot of the black suits. So the first thing they do is like get like Xavier in like a recliner chair or something, and it's like, oh, we gotta make sure he's comfortable, and we get introduced to all four of the original X-Men. These are the four first ones. You got Cyclops, you got Angel, you got Beast, you got Iceman. You got a white guy, a white guy, a white guy, a white guy. Yeah, like, we all love the X-Men, right? You know, we love Storm, you know, Wolverine, and, oh, they aren't here yet. Okay, awesome. Yeah, one of the core issues with this book, it's very simple, but it's, like, you see these guys, you can see them on the front. They're all the fucking same character. The only real difference you get is, like, Cyclops is a little bit more smart than the others. Iceman is a fucking child. Jean Grey is the woman. Just the woman trademark. And Beast speaks like he's eaten 8 thesauruses. He's like, oh, but I pontificated this shit. It's like, why? It's just like, it doesn't do it. I guess it builds character, but it's not in like an interesting way. It's just, oh, he's a smart guy. They're all fucking smart guys. I'm already getting ahead of myself. That's kind of the thing. With 67, you can realize it very, very soon, is that these guys are all very, very uninteresting. So the first thing that you'll notice, because there's a lot of what I love to call early installment weirdness. It's one of my favourite things in anything, is going back to the early stage of something and seeing just how fucking different stuff is. And, like, a very good example I think of is in The Simpsons. In season 1 of The Simpsons, it's all gradient backgrounds. It's all just, like, different gradients for the first half of season 1. It's really, really weird looking. And this is full of it. For example, Xavier, for the first, like, 10 pages, doesn't say anything. He does it solely verbally. And when you consider that he's, you know, in the wheelchair and stuff, my first thought was, like, is he a vegetable of some kind? Like, that's probably not the right term to use for it, but, like, is he, like, completely catatonic and, like, can only speak through thoughts? That's weird, but no, because that's not even, like, a twist. They just casually have it be like, oh, I'll assume to normal speaking. It's like, huh? So we get introduced to them doing their, you know, whole shtick. And how do they do it in a simple way? Oh, yeah, they just go through, like, a demonstration of all their powers to Xavier. It's very uninteresting. Because one thing you'll see is, like, for example, in the original Fantastic Four, they all show their powers in these sort of very, well, simple, still shows you a bit about who they are as people, you know? I actually can't remember how Reed shows his power, but I think that's just because he's like, oh, I'll do a stretchy thing, yeah. Then, you know, we see, he fires off like a fantastic flare. Sue Storm is currently there speaking with someone, you know, showing that she's a bit of like a socialite. She's the flare and she casually runs to get out. Probably one of the least interesting, but, you know, it's something. It shows us a little bit of who she is. And then we get to, you know, the Human Torch, and he's like a cool kid working on cars, right? And then he sees a flare, flames on, flies through the car, destroying what he was just working on, you know? It shows that, you know, he's a bit young, you know, he has a passion for vehicles, cars and such. And it also shows that he's reckless. It actually gets across a lot of his personality at once without really having to, of course, just... Of course it does that because it's Stan Lee and this guy just loved writing. But there was still that sense of, like, even through just the pages alone, Jack Kirby is getting across these guys' personalities. And then you get to the Thing. And he's in a big trench coat, fedora. He's in a big guy shop, right? One of those specific ones for, like, really big tall men, like Stewie has in that one cutaway. And what happens is he's, you know, walking through and he sees the flare and he just rips off this trench coat, barges through the door. And, you know, even though it's funny because you think, how the fuck did he get it in the first place? You know, the fact that, you know, he's wearing the trench coat, he's in this shop for stuff, you can tell he's probably a little bit, you know, self-conscious about his appearance. And his recklessness also shows that, you know, he's a bit angry, he's a bit hot-headed. But also shows that he and Ben and Johnny are somewhat of the same person. They're cut from the same cloth. They're both being reckless and irresponsible. And that's something that, you know, very much we see later on, is that Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm, despite their constant bickering, they have each other's back more than basically anyone else in Marvel when push comes to shove. And that was, you know, although not to the same extent, there was still that general sense of they're very similar more than they'd like to admit. They're both seeing that they need to help the Fantastic Four and recklessly going towards it just because that's the kind of people they are. In this, they are just going through a danger room exercise. Except it's not the danger room. It's like, it's the danger room, but it's not the danger room. It's like a danger room, and there's a panel. I'll try and see it, but you can see it is just on like a second floor window. Don't get me wrong, the Winchester Mansion is still like incredibly far away from like any regular road, but at the same time, that's really weird. Especially because it is just a room. There's nothing special about it. It just has a bunch of like machinery in it. There's not the danger room, but it's got like the active like viewing sort of window and stuff. That's like something that comes along later, and I think that's interesting how you can tell Stanley had the idea, and Jack Kirby had the idea, of course, of like a room where they get tested on their abilities, but nothing more than that. And so this little sequence ends with what else but them fighting? I don't know if it's Jack Kirby, Stanley, or both, but they really fucking liked having heroes fight each other for the stupidest reasons. So what happens is that like Iceman, he's told like, oh, you can just like play because you're like 16 or something like that. Which, wow, Xavier not wanting 16-year-olds to fight. Imagine that, wowza. So he's just like, oh, you can do whatever you want. And then he just tells fucking Beast to throw a bowling ball at him. And there's actually one thing that's interesting about this early Iceman. He's drawn like a snowman. And I think that's really interesting. Because the old Marvel method is Stan and Jack would talk about a story idea they had. Like, oh, we're going to draw the X-Men. They're going to be a group of wacky teenagers. Oh, what's that, Stan? Yeah, you know, there's going to be man-made ice. And, you know, potentially Jack Kirby heard of a guy made of ice and did it as a snowman. Whereas, you know, Stanley, you know, Iceman, Bobby Drake. So he said, oh, he's Iceman. And then a few issues later, we can see he actually is like more of like an ice man. You can see there. So I think that's just something very interesting. Is, you know, the idea that those occasional little lapses in communication could happen. Because maybe this was meant to be like the proper danger room that we had in mind. Because Xavier's just kind of in the middle of the room, just hoping he doesn't get hit. Which, like, they even mentioned in this thing, like, hey, Beast, you almost threw a bowling ball right past the Professor's skull. So yeah, as per normal, they just fight, and then Xavier's like, stop, there's a woman coming. And we get this very weird thing where they're all just staring at her, and they're like, wow, she's beautiful. Oh, what a name. Except for, funnily enough, Iceman. Yeah, I know, that is not intentional. But the fact that even all the way back in the 60s, Iceman isn't showing interest in a woman the same way everyone else is. I know that is not the intent. The intent is he's 16, he's still probably thinking of cooties or whatever. But that's really interesting, knowing now that Bobby Drake is gay, or at least bisexual. He's comics, he's probably bisexual. That's the general rule of thumb, is that half these characters have dated women before being known as gay. They're probably bisexual. So, and then we get introduced to, you know, all of our, you know, actual mutants by their names, you know? We have Hank McCoy, the Beast. We have Bobby Drake, Iceman, and Slim Summers. Yeah, that's right, it's not Scott, it's Slim. Which is really, really weird. And it's not as though it's like, you know, Iceman saying like, hey, Slim, come over here. Like, no, it's Xavier calling him Slim Summers, our human Cyclops. Do you see this shit all over, like, old school Marvel of Stan Lee just constantly changing names? Bob Banner and Peter Palmer appear in, like, Hulk and Spider-Man. He just... That, to me, is one of the bigger evidences towards Stan Lee did write stuff. Is the constant changing. Because I think if he was taking credit for someone else, he'd be super pedantic about making sure the names always lined up. But that very fly by the seat of your pants kind of attitude, like, oh, it's Palmer, yeah, we'll give that a try. I feel like, to me at least, that kind of implies there is an element of Stan Lee was involved and was trying to, of course, like, fix stuff as he went, at least to me. For all I know, he's just completely making all this shit up, and in reality this was poor, like, I don't know, Mike David, some poor intern who they just got to write all of these words, which, if that was the case, Jesus Christ, because, There's a lot of words in this comic. Stanley just vomits out words. It's one of the main things that makes a lot of his books so hard to get into. So, so Jean Grey's here and she shows off her power in at least a somewhat interesting way that shows a bit of her character. She sees, like, Scott and, like, Hank trying to, like, pull out a chair and she just brings it to herself, like that. That's something that's, while small, it actually shows a bit of character, unlike them just going through danger room exercises and showing that, like, they can go through the danger room. So, and Xavier just explains to Jean Grey and the audience, of course, this is why mutants, they don't like us, they don't like mutants. And there's a really, really interesting line in this page here. I was born of parents who had worked on the first A-bomb project. Like yourselves, I am a mutant, possibly the first such mutant. That is really interesting. So a really big thing with early Marvel is radiation. Of course, the example is the Hulk. Gamma bomb absorbs the radiation, becomes a big fucking green thing. And of course, you also have, like, Spider-Man bitten by the radioactive spider. And then we have this, where his parents worked on the A-bomb, and he was one of the first mutants. So does that mean that mutants are caused by radiation? Of course, we know now of the existence of, like, ancient mutants, like Apocalypse, for example. This is not the case. But back then, it seemed to be the case these were mutations caused by radiation. I think that's really interesting, but I'm also really glad it isn't the case, because it's just also, like, yet another example of, like, radiation being fucking everything. It could be worse. It could be Ultimate Universe, where it's all the super soldier serum, because the Ultimate Universe was constantly throating the super soldier serum any chance it got, because Bendis set it up in Ultimate Spider-Man. So, of course, he explains, like, we're just mutants, the humans distrust us. And immediately Hank tries kissing Jean Grey, because this is a 60s comic and we can't treat a women nicely. So we have this, and then Xavier's like, there are evil mutants that don't want to help us. And we cut to Magneto, who is in a secret laboratory near Cape Citadel, which I believe is some kind of US military base. Might be made up, might be not. Early Marvel was really weird, because it's trying to be in our world. Fantastic Four is infamous for this, with the amount of times there would just be them talking about the comic you're reading, or there's a whole issue with Stan and Jack where they accidentally create Doctor Doom again. It's so weird, and I really love that. So yeah, they definitely tried to go for this sort of weird, this is the world that you never get to see thing. But then they have, in all of New York, get, like, rampaged by monsters. It's like, what is going on here? So there's a rocket about to go off, and Magneto stops it. Not through good old magnetism, through magnetic energy and magnetic waves. I don't think Stan Lee knew what a magnet was. Or at least he didn't care what a magnet was. He either didn't know or didn't care what a magnet actually was. Because he could do fucking anything. If Magneto sees something, he could probably fucking do it. So the first thing he does is that he destroys the rocket, and they say, he's been doing this a lot. And then he just goes apeshit. So he, like, grabs guns and just starts firing them rapidly. He starts getting tanks and, like, moving them around. And then he, like, gets it literally says the dust particles from the air. So I'm guessing it's, like, iron and stuff in the air. And he arranges it to make it say, surrender the base or I'll take it by force. And he keeps saying about his magnetic impulses. And it's like, what? This is how Magneto... How powerful is Magneto? Because it doesn't say... It just says near Cape Citadel, a secret laboratory. I don't know if that means he's, like, just, like, a couple miles away, if that. No, not even that. If he's a couple miles away, it's still a long time. But, like, depending on how powerful this is, this could be just, like, this guy could do all the 60s Magneto could do Ultimatum. So, once again, he then uses his magnetic energy and, like, it like, bends and shit into, like, this different missile, and he, like, fires it into a chip. And it's like, what? How are you doing this? This is way too powerful. And then what happens is that he simply just walks in to the gate. And what he does is, of course, he gets a magnetic shield around him, which is something he does. And then he's like using it to like propel people away, and it's like, this is not... He can't... Magnets can't force a human away. Unless all these guys are just covered in like fillings. All these guys have shit tons of fillings, shit tons of like metal. They are all soldiers, so that might be the case. But also, I don't think like they don't specify. Oh, he's using he's using like our helmets and stuff. He says it's like he's got an invisible barrier around him, hurling us away. So he can just do that shit, and then he also narrows the magnetic waves around the lesser humans. Tell me what the fuck that means. Magneto, what does this mean? So, Magneto is using magnets, the magnetic waves, to circle people to keep them trapped. Not using, like, metal, which he can do. It's not as though he can't use metal. He can. He uses it on Slim Summers later. He's just not like using metal, he's just like using magnetic waves. So like, is the idea meant to be that he can use like metal is meant to be like a twist? Because it's not, because everyone knows magnets use metal. So it's one of those things where you just question what is going on here. So of course what happens is they're immediately like, oh no, there's an evil mutant. As long as there isn't a brotherhood of them, we'll be fine. And one of my favorite things is I believe that Warren says, "Yibo! Action at last! Gangway!" Which just reeks of Stanley, just like, jeez, what did they for today say? I don't know, Yibo? Yeah, I think I heard some kids say that, some crazy kids. Because there's a lot of examples back then of just like characters just saying the weirdest shit. And we get to see the X-Men prepare a little bit. You know, we get to see Iceman put on his boots, which I guess does imply that I think he just freezes over his clothes, which, goddamn, that must be awful. That means he's always walking around in wet clothes. I never realized that. But yeah, Bobby Drake is just always, like, sopping wet, which is disgusting to think about. And we get a little bit of Warren just, like, taking off, like, the harness he wears, which is what keeps his wings in check. I'm willing to bet at least a part of that was that Jack Kirby didn't want to keep drawing wings constantly, which I can't blame him. So then what happens is they're in a jet. It is not actively the Quinjet, I think it's called. It is a remote control private jet, which is being controlled by the Professor. Thoughts? How powerful is his abilities? Because, yeah, Xavier's always been, like, one of the most powerful mutants, but he's never... This is, like, the only time he's ever quite been the, he could be... Because it says here they're driven to an airport in a Rolls Royce, which implies there is a good bit of distance. And then, because they don't have the Quinjet, like, on the grounds. No, they have to fly to a different airport, and then he is using his psychic abilities to fly. How much can he think? How much is telepathy? So, the X-Men arrive... And they're all just like, hey, yeah, you know, we don't know what we're doing, so you know what, just go in. That was one thing that was very common back then, sort of, was just the military just being like, hey, it's one of the, like, superhero people. Fuck it, we're bored, we don't know what to do against this guy. Cap, you go, you know what you're doing. So, of course, they all start, like, going through, and, funny enough, they all aggressively barge through the soldiers for no reason. Like, okay. Cyclops seemingly goes through normally, but Bobby Drake just, like, freezes his way through and freezes some of their, like, weapons. Angel flies over, yeah. Beast is, like, jumping over their heads, and Jean Grey is just flying them all up. For no reason. Beast, Jean Grey, you don't need to be doing all this. Oh, excuse me. Marvel Girl. What a presumptuous fucking thing to say, by the way, Marvel. Oh yeah, this Jean Grey, she's Marvel Girl. She's gonna be the face of Marvel. No, she isn't. She's even the face of the fucking X-Men. That's Storm. Way to, like, just set yourself some expectations you are never going to match. So, then what happens? So, Scott attacks one of the magnetic fields that Magneto has set up, and he takes his full visor, and there is immediately a really cool effect, where it's like his entire head is just encased in beam. That is really cool. I'll fully give it that. And this, like, staggers Magneto. He's like, I wish I'd prepared for such an onslaught. It's like, could he feel the magnetic waves? That's very... Why is he like this? Why is Magneto this strange? So then what he does, he fires missiles, and we see them all deal with them, you know? Angel is, like, flying through them. Iceman freezes them. And then, like, Hank, he, like, grabs it, and he, like, throws it into the water. And, like, Jean Grey also helps. Jean Grey doesn't really do a whole lot. You could very easily write most female characters out of these old books. I don't know if it was Jack Kirby or Stan Lee or a mixture of both. Probably was a mixture of both. But it just feels like half the time women just aren't allowed to do a lot of things. This is better than... Because Fantastic Four and Avengers, oh my god. Sue Storm and Wasp are active detriments to their team. At least Marvel Girl will help every once in a while. And even then she doesn't do a whole lot. So yeah, Warren Angel flies towards him, and then he just gets, like, hit by a bunch of general, like, metal bullshit. And then they fight, and it's like, oh, we're gonna, like, blow him. And so Magneto sets fire to a whole bunch of, like, rocket fuel. And then off panel, it said, oh yeah, Cyclops, like, burrowed underneath the floor whilst we were, like, encased in ice. And it's like, what? Yeah, because you can see in the like, panel where it shows him underneath, Cyclops isn't looking down. He's just there. So, maybe it was meant to be something different. I don't know. So, Magneto just flies off. He just says, "You rue the day you beat me, but I'll be back!" It just flies off. All they managed to do was, I shit you not, mildly stagger him with magnetic fields, and then Cyclops hit him with a small blast, and he pussied away. What a bitch. Magneto really, really sucks in the 60s. Magneto didn't have any of the, like, the Holocaust background, or any of his, like, the simultaneous, like, he's really tragic, but you understand where he's coming from. Here, he's just a mustache-twirling villain of the day, except he's a villain every day, because Jesus Christ, it was either Magneto or a random Iron Man sealess shit tier like Count Nefaria. Who the fuck cares about Count Nefaria? No one. So after they fly away, they do say uncanny, which you know, maybe that was where they got the inspiration for. All the way in, like, the 70s. Yeah, it was like the late 70s where they made the change from just X-Men to Uncanny X-Men, because a certain guy called Claremont did that. You can definitely tell this is a very early comic book. And I think, before closing thoughts, I should give the closing of the issue, which is quite interesting. Because this military guy, he's like an officer or something at Cape Citadel, says, "You call yourselves the X-Men? I will not ask you to reveal your true identities, but I promise you that before this day is over, the name X-Men will be most honored in my command." That is really interesting. The idea of the military actively respecting the X-Men compared to later, where they're treated more akin to second-class citizens. Because that's one thing that I think is kind of interesting about older X-Men, is it's said more to be that, like, the mutant hate is more of a loud minority than an outright, like, oh, we will, like, kill all mutants and everyone ever. And I kind of prefer that to an extent. To be fair, it's very fast and loose. Even Claremont, with all of his writing skill, was very much just yes, sometimes everyone wants mutants dead, sometimes it's just, like, a small group of, like, hateful individuals, and, you know, sort of that thing, like, if people don't actively take stands against it, it's very fast and loose a lot of the time. So yeah, that was X-Men issue 1. We're only going to be covering the first issue because it's already, like, half an hour, and there's not a lot you can say about Silver Age stuff. So yeah, you can tell this is an old comic book, but it doesn't have any of the charm of an old comic book. Because stuff like Old Fantastic Four has the fucking surreal, weird backgrounds. And Spider-Man has a very hokey but very genuine sense of just charm. It's a very retro charm. This is just boring as shit. This is just a bunch of characters just being really, really uninteresting. Because you notice how I didn't say, like, any character moments here at all? Outside of the X-Men fight, Bobby Drake's a little immature. Jean Grey pulls a chair for herself. That is it. There is no character building in any of this. And that continues for so fucking long of the original X-Men. That's why Claremont completely revolutionized it. Claremont's the reason you like X-Men, because he made you give a shit about these guys. I read most of the original X-Men run on and off. I did skip to Uncanny. I skipped when Claremont came on, because Uncanny was like 20 issues in. But then I did go back and I've read most of the original X-Men. It's fine. Really all I can say about that. It's a fine enough comic. So, there's just nothing here. There's nothing really to get interested in. The characters aren't very interesting, and there's no attempts to make them interesting. If you really like X-Men, it's worth giving a shot as just a history piece. But if you really want to start X-Men, you start with Claremont. He makes you like them. He makes you give a shit about them. He's actually a writer who cares. I don't think Stan Lee or Jack Kirby really cared much for the X-Men. And that's not an unpopular opinion. Just the complete and utter lack of any real development for any of these guys really, really shows. So, yeah, I suppose that's it for today. I'll meet you next time on Comic Covers, the show where we cover comics. I'll see you guys then.